Hello, I'm Marilyn Moore. This is the first part of an interview with George H. Smith on the subject of happiness in a godless world. Happiness is an issue philosophers have discussed and debated for 2,500 years. It's an issue that concerns every human being. It's often been said that atheists aren't happy people. In other words, that the belief in God is necessary for happiness. It should come as no surprise to anyone that George disagrees. As you might expect, some of George's ideas about happiness are controversial. In preparation for this interview, George sent me a set of quotations about happiness from some notable philosophers and psychologists. In this segment, we talk about Aristotle and Sigmund Freud. Hi, George. How are you?
I'm fine, Marilyn. How are you doing today?
I am well, thank you. I asked you here today because I wanted to discuss happiness and atheism.
Okay.
Since we last spoke, I've been thinking a lot about this. In Atheism, the case against God, you point out, for example, that atheism is neither a way of life nor a specific philosophical system. So I'm wondering, what's the payoff of atheism and happiness, for happiness?
Actually, I don't think there is any, per se. As you pointed out, atheism is just the absence of belief in God. That in itself doesn't imply any particular philosophical beliefs, positive beliefs. So you could have, I suppose, happy atheists and miserable atheists. Unlike, I suppose, what people expect me to say, that, you know, atheism is one of the essential steps to happiness. I don't believe that at all. There are many more issues involved in the issue of happiness than mere atheism. It's almost like saying, what's the effect of not believing in Santa Claus on happiness? Well, are children who believe in Santa Claus happier before they lose their belief than afterwards? Well, who knows? You know, it's a difficult question to answer. So, I don't think there is any necessary relationship between atheism and happiness.
Okay. Well, what about you? Do you have a personal theory of happiness?
Not really.
Okay.
It's going to be a short interview, isn't it? No, let me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Is it a question that is it something you think about? Is it a value?
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, and I was being a little facetious when I answered your question. I don't have a comprehensive theory of happiness. I have ideas about it that I think are pretty sound. But as we'll get into a little later, I think, the conditions of happiness are so specific and so highly contextual. I think we can generalize a little bit about what's necessary for our happiness. And if you want to call that a theory, yes, I have a theory. For example, I could say don't slit yourself with razors on a regular basis, or stick pins, you know, in your earlobes, or will cause yourself pain. I mean, if you want to call that a theory. But anyway, in terms of a systematic theory, no, I don't have a systematic theory.
Oh, George, I was sort of hoping you would have the secret, and I could tell it to the world.
Well, I do have the secret, but it costs a lot of money. See, I'm going to publish George Smith's Secret to Happiness.
George Smith's.
And people pay me a lot of money, and then they'll read the book and they'll go, oh, I've only read that about 10,000 times.
Right. Meanwhile, you'll be happy, though.
Money makes me happy.
Everybody's money, yeah.
Well, it doesn't make me happy. It makes me, what's the right word? As close to happy as I'm probably going to get.
Okay.
For the rest of my life.
All right. Well, George, when I contacted you earlier and said I wanted to talk about happiness, you deluged my inbox with a number of quotations from noteworthy philosophers, which I found interesting because I didn't realize that there is a long-standing philosophical debate on the subject of happiness.
Yes.
And so
in fact, I would say almost that, going back to the pre-Socratics even, happiness is probably one of the oldest philosophical topics in philosophy. And it was considered sort of, you mentioned payoff. Happiness was traditionally considered, with some exceptions, to be sort of the payoff of being a philosopher. The philosopher of older times was sort of the psychologist of what we'd call in modern times. He was a sage. He just didn't have, or I would say she, but they're really sort of a male-dominated profession, I'm afraid. The philosopher was the person you went to for advice, for practical advice. it was based on theoretical knowledge, but unless you could put the theoretical knowledge into practical wisdom, it wasn't considered of much use, at least in some schools. So therefore, you know, the sage was the guy who said, look, son, if you want to be happy, here's what you have to do. And you get into that kind of master grasshopper, you know, sort of, you know, go back to the, what's that old television show?
Kung Fu.
Yeah, yeah. You get into that sort of instructional sort of thing.
I see. Well, that's interesting because I would like to know more about happiness, and I'm very interested in what these philosophers have to say. So I'm just wondering if you could tell me why you sent the quotations that you sent.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I know we've talked about this, but for people watching this, when Marilyn asked me you know, that she said to me, or asked if I would participate in this interview, I indicated that the issue of happiness is so complicated, both historically because of all the different theories. I mean, maybe later on in a subsequent part of this interview we can talk about eudaimonism versus hedonism and the issue, are all pleasures the same? Are there different qualities of pleasure? Are there higher pleasures of the mind versus lower pleasures of the body, etc., etc.? In other words, just to launch into this topic kind of cold and would be very difficult because you know where to start. So I thought before we do get into that sort of thing, I would provide you with some interesting passages from various philosophers about happiness, and then by commenting on those passages, first of all, I have a little bit of heads-up warning about what I'll be having to answer so I can organize my thoughts a little better. And secondly, it will give sort of a general indication of where I stand. So in a later part of this interview, if you want to get into some of those more technical aspects, viewers of this video will already kind of know what my general point of view is. That was the reason for sending you the quotations.
Okay. Well, how about this? I'm going to read you a quotation and ask you how that fits into the debate,
Sure.
where it fits in,
Sure.
what's interesting about it. This first quotation is from Aristotle. I think it was the Nicomachean Ethics.
Nicomachean, yeah.
Okay.
Right.
One swallow does not make a summer, nor does one day. And so too, one day or a short time does not make a man blessed and happy.
Right. Yeah, that's a very famous passage from Aristotle. The older translation, one day does not a summer make, is a little more poetic, but that's, if people have ever heard that passage, that's probably what they've heard. I've had people tell me they thought that came from Shakespeare. One swallow does not a summer make. But that's important for a number of reasons. I don't really want to try to explain Aristotle's theory of happiness. First of all, I'm not an expert on it by any means.
Okay.
I know certainly the general outline of it. But that shows the Aristotelian view, and this was fairly characteristic of Greek thinkers in general, that happiness is not a transitory state. In other words, if you say, I'm happy right now, but 5 minutes ago I wasn't happy, to many Greek philosophers that wouldn't make a lot of sense. When they talked about happiness, or eudaimonia, they didn't really mean what many people mean by happiness today. Rather, they meant something that's sort of a tenor of life, a quality of life that goes throughout a person's entire life. In fact, I've heard it said, I don't know if Aristotle actually said this, but that according to some Greek philosophers, you couldn't really tell whether a man was happy until after he was dead. Because only then could you really judge his entire life, his entire lifespan. And certainly for Aristotle, happiness is a quality that you don't aim at directly. It's a quality of, it's an emotional quality that sort of accompanies successful activity. So to the extent you set goals and you're successful, happiness accompanies that. It's just part of human nature, the sort of teleological, purpose-driven, goal-driven view of human life and of life generally. That also, by the way, and I really don't want to get into this here, I want to keep these answers fairly brief, that gets into the issue of whether they're different, whether happiness is nothing but the sum of pleasures or whether all pleasures are the same. Basically, Aristotle held the view in contrast to, say, some of the hedonists, so-called, like Epicurus, that happiness is something more than just a sum of pleasures, and that pleasures themselves differ according to the different activities you pursue. So the happiness that I might get from playing chess is not, or the pleasure I would get from playing chess would not necessarily be the kind of same pleasure I would get from, say, writing or engaging in some other activity. So joys or our pleasures tend to be very, very specific to the kind of activity that they accompany.
Okay.
But we can, as I said, that gives you some idea of the complexity of the issues involved regarding happiness and pleasure and so on and so forth.
Is there an ethical component for Aristotle?
Yeah, there definitely is. And it's in the Aristotelian tradition, ethics is basically the art of living well. It's a practical discipline. The purpose of ethics is, it's a little more complicated with Aristotle because he gets it mixed up with his politics, and I don't really want to get into that. But in the broad sense, if you read a modern Aristotelian philosopher like Henry Veitch's book, Rational Man, his views are very close, for example, to Ayn Rand's, that people need ethics as a guide to a good life. And the idea of a summum bonum, a supreme good, is really key to the Aristotelian tradition. The idea being that you can't have goals that are just means to other goals. There has to be a supreme goal, something valuable for its own sake and something that's an ultimate value. Again, sort of roughly putting it, for the Aristotelians, that's happiness. Happiness is that towards which all things aim. Okay. We take actions ultimately in order to be happy.
All right.
Again, I'm sort of skipping a lot of material here. I'm just, again, trying to give a general overview. And I would say that, again, generally speaking, I'm in the Aristotelian tradition myself. It's just that I'm not a devout disciple of it. I see problems in almost any theory of happiness that I know about.
All right. Here's another one from Sigmund Freud.
Okay.
Freud says, "There is no sovereign recipe in this matter which suits all. Each one must find out for himself by which particular means he may achieve felicity. All kinds of different factors will operate to influence his choice."
Okay, yeah, I think that's one of the most intelligent statements about happiness I've ever read. That's why I included it. I must say I'm not a Freudian. Some of his, psychological theories are just very strange. But as with so many great thinkers, and I do consider, and he was an atheist, by the way, Freud was,
okay.
an avowed atheist. It's like so many great thinkers, and you read them, and this applies to almost any philosopher, and you don't agree with a lot of what they say philosophically. You're going to, I think, be reading a Schopenhauer passage. I don't like Schopenhauer's philosophy. But some of these guys were very astute in terms of their introspection and psychological observations. And if only Freud had left out a lot of his, what I consider rather pretentious and absurd technical theories, and dealt with these more common sense statements like you just read, I think he would be more widely read today than he is now. I should mention that passage, as I recall, is from Civilization and Its Discontents.
Okay.
And basically, what Freud goes on to say in that passage, or at least the passage I took that quote from, is that, of course, he has to talk in terms of narcissistic personalities, and he uses his lingo. But he points out that people have different dispositions. Some he apparently thought were inherent, some were acquired. And what will make us happy will tend to depend on what type of people we are. And so, and I love that phrase, sovereign recipe. Freud is saying there is no sovereign recipe for happiness. There is no one right way to pursue happiness. It's something people have to learn on their own. And I should mention that ties in Freud himself, a very good book. In fact, just coincidentally, I was rereading it the other day, Peter Gay's book on Freud, called The Jewish, what's it called? I can't remember. He wrote a thin book on Freud, deals with his atheism. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the title. Peter Gay being the historian who wrote a wonderful 2-volume work on the Enlightenment. And Gay points out that Freud was very much in the Enlightenment tradition, and that idea that you can't have a sovereign recipe for happiness, and in some respects, I don't think Gay actually says this himself, but this is my take on it, was typical of the Enlightenment when they were rejecting Christianity. Many of the Enlightenment, not all, but many of the Enlightenment philosophers, especially the French philosophers, were rejecting the Christian idea that there's just basically one way for everyone to become happy. You do what God says, go to church, and you end up in an afterlife, and there you're supremely happy and eternally happy. And against that, you find a lot of, especially in the 17th century, philosophers like Spinoza, John Locke, many others, of different philosophical persuasions, saying in effect, no, wait a second, it's not that simple. People are very diverse, they live in different cultures, and there is no, as Freud said, sovereign recipe for happiness. It's more complicated than that, but this was also kind of a rejection of the idea that the present life, our present life, is just sort of a preparation or a test, so to speak, for a future life. once you're an atheist or any type of agnostic or even skeptic, and you eliminate the afterlife, which traditionally was held up to be both the ultimate form of happiness and also the kind of the reason why you should be good on earth or be moral. But when you just deal with this life as all there is, that kind of changes the stakes, because now the emphasis becomes on happiness in this life. If you think that life, it should just be a travail of tears or misery in preparation for an afterlife, that's one thing. But if you have the idea that this is it, I miss this shot and there's no more, then in a sense you value what's scarcer. In other words, you value this relatively brief life we have, because that's all there is. If you think life's going to continue eternally, you go, well, if I mess up too much in this life, there's always, God knows I meant well and He'll reward me and I'll have to be happy forever. So it changes the stakes, but contrary to what some religious people tell you, I think it changes the stakes for the better. In the sense that you think, that this is something I don't want to waste, this life. Because that's it.
All right. Well, and it sounds to me as if he's saying that happiness is possible. The onus is on the individual to achieve it. Yeah.
In fact, in that very book, although I'm not an expert on Freud, but I do know what he says in Civilization is Discontents, and I didn't plan on discussing this part. My memory's a little hazy, but Freud discusses this kind of quest for, this is my term, transcendental happiness. In other words, people just feel dissatisfied all the time, and there are various ways that people have attempted to acquire a sort of peace of mind, contentment. There's one way of viewing happiness. Some philosophers view it that way, and they've sought it in various ways. One is in religious experiences that he acknowledges. William James said, the brilliant psychologist William James said very much the same thing, and he explores that in his famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Another way, as I recall, that Freud talked about was drugs. He specifically mentions drugs, him having been a cokehead himself for a number of years. And he thought that was another way, and he didn't disqualify it as illegitimate, by the way. He just sort of considered and said that's one way that people try to escape the constant discontent of their day-to-day routines. Because obviously we're never fully satisfied. If we were, we'd never act. The only reason we act is because we're dissatisfied with our present state of affairs, and we hope to get something that's more satisfactory. And that element of dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs, I think it was Pascal who once said that if you want to understand, I'm paraphrasing, if you want to understand why most people are not happy, you need to understand why most people can't sit still in a room in absolute quiet. And that was a very insightful observation, meaning a lot of people are in a very, they want to do something, want to keep active. Now for Aristotle, you see, that's not a bad thing. Aristotle didn't think of happiness as sort of a cow chewing contentedly on its cud. He thought more in terms of the active person. Whereas there's this other conception of happiness as kind of an equilibrium of emotions in the intellect, so that you're sort of a Buddha-like character. In fact, you find this concept in Buddhism, and you find certain Western philosophers like Schopenhauer praising Buddhism over Christianity. So again, this illustrates, if nothing else, the complexity of all this, and that's what I'm trying to indicate here.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to move on to the next one.
Oh, by the way, before we go any further, I'm sorry to interrupt, and I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought, but maybe I should just say a word why I think this is the sort of thing we're talking about, these philosophers and other philosophers can be useful to people.
Sure.
As I said in the beginning, I don't think there is a recipe for happiness. You can go buy all the self-help books you want. They may help for a while, and to the extent they help at all, it's largely because they get you thinking about certain things, and any number of similar books might have the same effect. But the reason I think that quotations like this, and I'm encouraging people to look into these philosophers, and again, even if you disagree with their technical philosophy, doesn't mean that their observations aren't in some sense useful or valid. And what I'm stressing here is, as you read those passages, it doesn't really matter whether you're a Freudian to appreciate what Freud said. You can appreciate without agreeing with him, in psychological theories. When we get into other philosophers, you don't have to be a technical Aristotelian to appreciate what Aristotle said. And I'll tell you the truth, if I'm going through a bad period, and I've done this many times, if I'm feeling depressed, I'll sometimes pick up some of these philosophers and read what they had to say about happiness. And in fact, I find very pessimistic philosophers like Schopenhauer even more helpful. And it sounds like an odd way to get yourself out of depression, but sometimes they're so exaggerated and almost comical and humorous in their depressing view of life that you go, "No, come on, things aren't this bad. I mean, let's give me a
Feel
break."
better already.
And I find it very comforting. For me, it's sort of my intellectual comfort food. So the reason I brought this up, Marilyn, is because I want to stress, especially for my friends out there who are, what's the right word to use, Randians, perhaps, that you have to be open-minded about who you read, and whoever kind of hits a nerve with you philosophically, they can be very useful in regard to happiness.
All right, and so if you're interested, you don't have to pull it out of thin air. That in fact there's a great deal.
Oh yeah, and as I said, there's a huge amount of material on this. A lot of them are aphoristic writings, like Nietzsche as an example. Schopenhauer wrote a number of very amusing things about happiness. I think probably the greatest practical advantage to be had from these older philosophers in particular is the psychological angle.
Okay.
Because they were very smart, introspective people. And you don't have to agree with their interpretations. And I've noted before, you can still appreciate what they have to say.
All right. Well, and use it as a point of departure, especially even if you disagree, then you've got a place to start.
Yeah, and it's really hard to disagree. And I mean, there are some things, obviously, I think you'll be reading later a lengthy passage from Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm right. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now there, clearly I disagree. But even Augustine, who's heavily, of course, giving a theological interpretation to things, and maybe I should wait till later to get into this, but even then you can kind of understand his perspective, even if you're an atheist. You wouldn't put it in the same terms. But it's a common human experience. When you read people from 2,000, 2,500 years ago, and they talk about certain types of pleasure being unsatisfying in a way, and there's certain types of pain, pleasures. Plato talks about this, and I'm not certainly a fan of Plato. I forget which one of the Socratic dialogues it is, but certain pleasures are not pure, they're sort of mingled with pain. A lot of philosophers talked about things like why we become so involved and enhanced by tragedies. Well, they make us cry, they make us sad. Well, how come that's pleasurable? I mean, isn't sad a bad thing? And they go into this whole theory of catharsis that you find. It gets very complex, and the lesson I draw from this is, in terms of sort of common sense psychological advice, I think the ancients and the philosophers general had pretty much figured everything out before the modern psychology profession came along. I'm not saying that we haven't made advances in brain science and that sort of thing, neurophysiology and such, but that's not the point here. The point is, in terms of the basic insights into the human condition, I sort of gave up reading pop psychology books a few decades ago. They all started to read the same to me. And with some exceptions, I think there are good writers in that field. But I think you can find much better insights in great philosophers.